I practically sprinted up our driveway, holding my two kids tightly by the hand, my heart racing with the news that I had just inherited $25 million and a commercial skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan. I could not wait to tell my husband that our financial struggles were permanently over and that our lives were about to change forever. But when I reached the front porch, my husband was already standing there with his bags packed and divorce papers in his hand. Standing right next to him was his much younger junior analyst with a smug and victorious smile on her face. "Pack your bags," she sneered, looking me up and down. "This house has no room for a leech." I looked at the divorce papers, then looked at her and simply smiled. "Okay," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "What is so funny?" she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "Actually," I replied, staring directly into her eyes, "this house belongs to me." If you have ever watched the people who dragged you through the mud suddenly realize they are standing on your property, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear exactly how a so-called leech dismantled a toxic marriage and reclaimed her empire brick by brick. My name is Jasmine, and I am 35 years old. 7 years ago, I stepped away from a thriving career as a senior art director at a top creative agency in Atlanta. I made the choice that so many mothers make. I transitioned to freelance graphic design so I could be fully present to raise our two beautiful children, Trey, who is now 8, and Aaliyah, who is 6. It was a joint decision between me and my husband Terrence, or at least it was supposed to be. Terrence is 37 and works as a mid-level manager at a corporate finance firm. When we first made the decision for me to step back, he promised we would operate as a team. He promised he would cover the main household expenses, while I kept my foot in the industry with freelance work and managed the home front. But over the years, as his salary increased, his respect for me decreased. He began to use his paycheck not as a tool to support our family, but as a weapon to control me. The reality of my suffocating marriage became a daily psychological battle. It usually started first thing in the morning. I vividly remember a specific Tuesday that encapsulated my entire existence. I was standing in our kitchen at 6 in the morning, flipping pancakes for Trey and Aaliyah, packing their lunch boxes, and making sure their homework was signed. Terrence walked into the kitchen, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He did not say good morning to me or the kids. He just poured his coffee and leaned against the granite counter, scrolling through his phone. When I quietly asked him for the weekly grocery money, he let out a long, exaggerated sigh, as if I had just asked him to donate a kidney. He pulled a thin stack of cash from his wallet and slammed it onto the counter. Then he started interrogating me about the previous week. He demanded to know why I bought the name brand orange juice instead of the store brand. He questioned why Trey needed a new winter coat when his old one still technically fit, even though the sleeves were 2 inches above his wrists. I tried to explain that growing children need proper clothing, but Terrence just rolled his eyes. "It is exhausting being the only one pulling their weight in this house," he said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You sit around at home all day doing your little drawings while I am out here grinding. You are draining my accounts. You are nothing but a leech, Jasmine." He said it right in front of Trey and Aaliyah. My 8-year-old son looked up from his pancakes, his eyes wide and confused. I felt a hot flush of humiliation burn my cheeks, but I bit my tongue and swallowed my pride. I smiled softly at my children, telling them to hurry up and eat so they would not be late for the bus. I could not afford to start a screaming match. I internalized the pain to keep the peace. That was my life. I was trapped in a financial hostage situation by a man who derived his self-worth from making me feel entirely worthless. The psychological toll of Terrence and his financial abuse was slowly destroying me from the inside out. Once the kids were dropped off at school, the house clean, and the laundry folded, I would sit at my kitchen island and open my laptop. I worked late into the afternoon and late into the night, taking on every low-paying design commission I could find just to afford the basic necessities my husband refused to pay for. I designed logos, flyers, and websites for small businesses using my hard-earned freelance money to buy Aaliyah her ballet shoes and Trey his soccer cleats. I bought their school supplies and covered their field trip fees because asking Terrence for money meant subjecting myself to another session of verbal degradation. Meanwhile, Terrence had no problem spending money on himself. He drove a leased luxury sedan that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. He bought Italian leather shoes and expensive watches, claiming he needed to look the part for his corporate finance job. He lived like a bachelor with a limitless budget, while I constantly checked my bank app before buying a gallon of milk. But the financial abuse was only one layer of the betrayal. One night, it was well past 11. I was sitting on the living room floor, squinting at my laptop screen, trying to finish a branding package for a client. Terrence was lounging on the sofa, watching television, with a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. His phone, resting on the coffee table, began to buzz relentlessly. I glanced over and saw a name flashing on the illuminated screen. Vanessa. It was the fourth time she had texted him that night. Vanessa was a 29-year-old junior analyst at his firm. Terrence casually reached over, snatched the phone, and shielded the screen from my view as he typed a rapid response. "Who is texting you this late?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Terrence did not even look up from his screen. "Just a finance emergency," he said dismissively. "These junior analysts do not know how to handle quarter-end reports without holding my hand. I am mentoring her, Jasmine. Do not start acting crazy and insecure." My intuition screamed that he was lying. A junior analyst does not text a mid-level manager at midnight with a heart emoji next to her name for a finance emergency. But I pushed the suspicion down deep into the pit of my stomach. If I confronted him without absolute proof, he would explode. He would threaten to cut off my access to the emergency household account. He would punish me by refusing to pay the electricity bill or withholding the kids' health insurance co-pays. So I remained silent. I kept typing on my keyboard, fighting back tears, focusing entirely on finishing my design project so I could earn an extra $200 for my children. I isolated myself in my silent struggle, enduring the disrespect to keep a roof over my babies' heads. But the disrespect did not just come from Terrence. It was a family tradition. Terrence was worshipped by his family as the golden child, the successful corporate provider who had made it out and achieved the American dream. I, on the other hand, was viewed as the ungrateful dependent who was holding him back. This dynamic was painfully obvious every time we attended the dreaded Sunday family dinner at my mother-in-law's house. The Sunday following the Vanessa texting incident, we all gathered in my mother-in-law's formal dining room. The atmosphere was already tense. Terrence sat at the head of the table, soaking up his mother's praise. Sitting directly across from me was Malik, who is Terrence's older brother, and Malik's wife, Lauren. Lauren is a wealthy white woman who married into our African-American family and operates with a breathtaking level of weaponized fragility and entitlement. Lauren did not work a single day in her life, having been funded by a massive trust fund from her parents. Yet she was treated with the utmost respect by my in-laws because her generational wealth gave her proximity to power. I, on the other hand, was constantly scrutinized. Halfway through the meal, Lauren took a delicate sip of her Chardonnay and targeted me with her usual passive-aggressive concern. "Jasmine," she cooed, her voice loud enough for the entire table to hear, "how is your little drawing hobby going? It must be so nice to just stay home and color all day, while Terrence works so incredibly hard to provide for everyone." I felt my grip tighten on my fork under the table. "Lauren," I replied, keeping my voice polite, "it is not a hobby. I am a professional graphic designer and I manage multiple freelance clients while also raising 2 children. Lauren let out a condescending sigh and reached over to gently pat Terrence on the arm. "You are such a good provider, Terrence," she said, shaking her head sympathetically. "Malik and I were just saying in the car how heavy your burden must be carrying a whole family on one real salary. I just do not know how you handle all that stress." I looked at my husband, expecting him to defend me. I expected him to tell his sister-in-law that I was an award-winning art director who sacrificed her career for the sake of our family. I expected him to demand respect for his wife. Instead, Terrence let out a loud, arrogant chuckle. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. "It gets incredibly heavy, Lauren," he agreed, shooting me a sideways glance. But someone has to be the man of the house and carry the dead weight. Malik laughed loudly, slapping his little brother on the back, while my mother-in-law nodded in solemn agreement. I sat there frozen in absolute humiliation. I looked around that dining table surrounded by people who actively delighted in my degradation. The cultural and class dynamics were suffocating. They prided themselves on corporate titles and viewed my creative labor and maternal sacrifices as completely worthless. They placed Terrence on a pedestal and allowed Lauren to punch down at me simply because I did not bring home a corporate paycheck. I looked down at my plate, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of pure rage against my ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and walk out of that house forever. But I thought of Trey and Aaliyah playing in the backyard, completely unaware of the cruelty happening inside. I swallowed my pride, holding back my tears, refusing to give Lauren the satisfaction of seeing me break. I realized in that profound moment of isolation that the man who stood at an altar and vowed to protect me was actively orchestrating my destruction. Terrence was not my partner. He was my warden, and I was entirely alone. I walked out of that formal dining room with my head held high, plastering a fake smile on my face for the sake of the kids, but inside, I was completely hollowed out. The drive home was agonizingly silent. Terrence blasted the sports radio, acting as if he had not just permitted his family to strip away my dignity. I stared out the passenger window, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of yellow, and let my mind escape to the only place where I felt entirely safe, entirely valued. I thought of great Uncle Elijah. Elijah was my maternal grandfather's brother, an eccentric, proud African-American man who marched entirely to the beat of his own drum. To the rest of my family, and especially to Terrence and his pretentious relatives, Uncle Elijah was nothing more than a crazy broke old man who refused to move out of his cramped apartment in Harlem. Terrence openly despised him. Whenever the holidays rolled around, Terrence would categorically refuse to invite Elijah over, claiming the old man embarrassed him with his outdated suits and his wild, rambling stories about buying up city blocks back in the 70s. Terrence and his brother Malik would sit around drinking expensive scotch, laughing at how Elijah was supposedly a cautionary tale of a black man who dreamed too big and ended up with absolutely nothing. But they did not know Elijah. They did not even try to know him. While they dismissed him as a failure, I saw a man possessing a rich, beautiful soul. Whenever the crushing weight of my marriage became too heavy to bear, whenever Terrence made me feel like I was nothing more than a financial burden taking up space in his house, I would pack Trey and Aaliyah into my beat-up sedan and make the drive up to Harlem. That modest apartment was my true sanctuary. Walking into Uncle Elijah's home was like stepping into a time capsule of Black history and unfiltered love. The apartment smelled of peppermint tea, old paper, and the faint sweet aroma of cherry pipe tobacco. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with overflowing bookshelves stacked with everything from first edition novels to heavy leather-bound texts on urban planning and architecture. To my children, this cramped space was a magical kingdom. Elijah would clear off his tiny wooden dining table, spread out large sheets of blank parchment paper, and let Trey and Aaliyah draw for hours. He would sit with them, telling them stories about the Harlem Renaissance, making them laugh until their stomachs hurt. And he never looked at my creative work as a silly little hobby. When Terrence would mock my graphic design commissions, Uncle Elijah would ask me to bring my laptop so he could see my latest projects. He would put on his thick wire-rimmed reading glasses, lean in close to the screen, and study every curve of my logos, every color palette, every typography choice. "You have the eye, Jasmine," he would tell me, his voice a deep, comforting rumble. "You see the structure of things. Do not ever let a man wearing a cheap suit tell you your vision is worthless. You are building something from nothing, and that is exactly how empires are born." I loved him unconditionally, not because of what he could provide, but because of how he made me feel. He made me feel seen. Sometimes while the kids were laughing at his dramatic retellings of old jazz club nights, he would lower his voice and tell me about the properties he supposedly owned. He would point out the window toward the towering Manhattan skyline and casually mention how he bought a commercial lot during an economic downturn, or how he held the deeds to buildings where corporate executives now sat. I used to smile and nod, finding his tall tales charming. I honestly believed it was just the harmless imagination of a lonely older man trying to impress his niece. I never cared if the stories were true. I just loved the light in his eyes when he told them. To me, his true wealth was his spirit. While Terence measured a person's value by the brand of their car or the balance in their checking account, Elijah measured value by loyalty, creativity, and resilience. He saw my silent struggles. He noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way my clothes were getting slightly looser, because I skipped meals to ensure the kids had fresh fruit, the way I flinched slightly when Terrence's name was brought up. Elijah never pried, but he always made sure to send me home with a heavy envelope of cash, claiming he had just won big at a neighborhood card game and had no use for the extra bills. Take it for the babies, he would insist, pressing the worn $20 bills into my palm. Do not let that husband of yours know. This is your rainy day fund, Jasmine. I saved every single dollar he gave me, hiding it in a hollowed-out book in my closet. That small stash of money was my only safety net, the only thing standing between me and total financial ruin. Uncle Elijah was my lifeline. He was the only person in the world who looked at me and saw a brilliant, capable woman instead of a leech. I cherished our afternoons in Harlem, completely unaware that this sweet, eccentric man was quietly evaluating my character, watching my endurance, and preparing to alter the trajectory of my entire existence. I thought I was just keeping a lonely old man company, but in reality he was watching me prove my worth. He saw the disrespect I endured, and he noted the grace with which I carried it. He knew my heart was pure because I loved him when the rest of the world decided he had absolutely nothing to offer. And because I asked for nothing, he secretly decided to give me absolutely everything. The phone call that shattered my reality came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was standing at the kitchen sink scrubbing a stubborn stain off a cereal bowl when my cell phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed a formal Manhattan area code. I wiped my soapy hands on my jeans and answered, expecting it to be a confused client or a spam call. Instead, a crisp, highly professional voice greeted me. The man introduced himself as Harrison Sterling, a senior partner at Sterling Montgomery, and Pierce, a top-tier law firm in New York City. My initial confusion quickly morphed into a cold, paralyzing dread as he asked if he was speaking to Jasmine. When I confirmed my identity, he delivered the news with practiced sympathy. Uncle Elijah had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 days prior. The bowl slipped from my fingers and clattered loudly into the stainless steel sink. I gripped the edge of the counter, struggling to pull air into my lungs. The world around me seemed to stop spinning. Uncle Elijah was gone. The only person who saw my worth, who encouraged my dreams, who treated my children like absolute royalty, had taken his final breath alone in his Harlem apartment. Mr. Sterling gave me a moment to compose myself before continuing. He explained that as the primary beneficiary of Elijah's estate, I was required to attend a formal reading of the will. It was scheduled for Friday morning at their corporate office in Midtown Manhattan. He offered his deepest condolences and instructed me to bring 2 forms of identification. I hung up the phone and slid down the kitchen cabinets until I hit the floor, pulling my knees to my chest and weeping until my throat ached. I cried for the loss of a beautiful soul and for the agonizing realization that my only safe harbor in this world no longer existed. When Terence walked through the front door that evening, I was sitting on the living room sofa, clutching a stack of drawings Trey and Aaliyah had made for their great-uncle. My eyes were red and swollen. I looked up at my husband, desperately hoping that for just one moment he would set aside his arrogance and simply hold me. I told him the news, my voice breaking as the words left my lips. Terence did not drop his briefcase. He did not rush over to comfort me. He did not even take off his expensive wool coat. He just stood in the foyer, let out an irritated sigh, and checked his luxury watch. "Well, that was bound to happen eventually," he said, his tone entirely devoid of empathy. "He was ancient Jasmine. Did he leave behind any debts we are going to be on the hook for, because I am absolutely not paying for his funeral?" I stared at the man I married, feeling a profound, sickening disgust radiate through my veins. I swallowed the lump in my throat and explained that a Manhattan law firm had contacted me. I told Terrence I needed to travel to New York by Friday morning for the reading of the will. Because my freelance invoices had not cleared yet for the month, I swallowed my pride and asked him to transfer enough money into my checking account to cover a round-trip Amtrak ticket. Terrence let out a loud, sharp bark of laughter. He tossed his briefcase onto the entryway table and glared at me as if I had just asked him to fund a vacation to Mars. "You want me to pay for a train ticket to New York so you can sit in some sketchy storefront lawyer's office?" he demanded, his voice rising with aggressive incredulity. "Are you out of your mind, Jasmine?" The man lived in a shoebox. What exactly do you think he left you? A collection of moth-eaten suits and some dusty books. "I am not funding a trip for you to go collect a crazy old man's junk." I pleaded with him, explaining that it was about respect. It was about honoring the memory of the only family member who had shown me unconditional kindness. I begged him to understand that I just needed to say a proper goodbye. Terrence stepped closer to me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are not getting a single dime from me for this foolishness." He snapped, his eyes narrowing with cruel authority. "You are a financial burden as it is. I work too hard to provide for this family to watch you waste my money on a pointless emotional field trip. Tell them to mail you whatever worthless trinkets he left behind. You are staying right here." He turned his back on me and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the silent living room. I sat there for a long time, letting his toxic words echo in my mind. He thought he had completely trapped me. He thought denying me access to the household funds would force me into submission. But Terrence underestimated the very survival skills he had forced me to develop. Long after he had gone to sleep, I crept into my bedroom closet and reached up to the highest shelf. I pulled down the hollowed-out dictionary where I kept my secret stash. Sitting on the floor in the dark, I counted the worn $20 bills Uncle Elijah had pressed into my palms over the years. I counted every single dollar of that rainy day fund. It was exactly enough to cover a last-minute train ticket to Penn Station and a cheap cup of coffee. I pulled out my phone and booked my seat right then and there. I texted my best friend asking her to take Trey and Aaliyah to school and watch them for the afternoon. I was not going to let Terrence strip me of my right to honor the man who believed in me. Before the sun even began to rise on Friday morning, I quietly packed a small tote bag. I dressed in my best professional suit, the one I used to wear back in my corporate days, making sure I looked polished and unbothered. I left a brief note on the kitchen counter, informing Terrence that childcare was handled and I would be back by evening. I did not ask for his permission. I simply informed him of my absence. Sitting by the window on the early morning train to New York, I watched the landscape blur past in shades of gray and blue. My heart ached heavily with grief for Uncle Elijah, but beneath that sorrow, a new fierce resolve was hardening my spirit. Terrence's blatant cruelty had severed the final fragile thread of respect I held for our marriage. I stepped off the train at Penn Station and walked out into the chaotic electric energy of Manhattan, holding my head high. I was fully prepared to accept a few cherished books or a sentimental photograph. I was completely unaware that I was walking directly into a boardroom that would hand me the keys to an empire. The address Mr. Sterling had given me belonged to a towering monolith of glass and steel right in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and rode a silent high-speed elevator up to the 52nd floor. The reception area of Sterling, Montgomery, and Pierce was intimidating and sterile. It smelled of lemon polish and old money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city below. I smoothed down the skirt of my old corporate suit and gave my name to the receptionist. Within seconds, Harrison Sterling appeared. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored navy suit. He greeted me with a firm handshake and genuine warmth, guiding me down a long corridor lined with modern art into a massive corner boardroom. I took a seat at a mahogany table that was long enough to comfortably seat 20 people. Mr. Sterling poured me a glass of sparkling water and took a seat across from me. He folded his hands, resting them on a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He started by expressing how much he admired my great-uncle. I expected him to talk about Elijah's kindness or his entertaining stories, but Mr. Sterling used words like shrewd visionary and titan. I stopped him politely and explained there must be some sort of misunderstanding. I told the lawyer that Uncle Elijah was a humble man who lived in a cramped apartment in Harlem and played cards with the neighborhood retirees. Mr. Sterling offered a small, knowing smile. He leaned back in his chair and explained the reality of the man I loved so dearly. Uncle Elijah was not a broke old man. He was an absolute titan of industry. Back in the 1970s and 80s, when the city was struggling, Elijah quietly bought up commercial real estate, empty lots, and residential blocks. He held on to everything, watching the market explode over the decades. He chose to stay in his Harlem apartment because it was where he and his late wife had built their life. He did not care about flashy cars or designer clothes. He cared about building an empire in the shadows. My mind struggled to process this information. The man who slipped me worn $20 bills for my children was secretly operating at the highest levels of Manhattan real estate. Mr. Sterling opened the heavy portfolio and slid a crisp white document across the polished wood. "Your uncle was a brilliant judge of character," Jasmine the lawyer said, his voice steady and serious. "He knew exactly what your husband's family thought of him. He knew they mocked him. He also knew that you were the only person who visited him out of pure unconditional love. He told me you never asked him for a dime and that you treated his small apartment like a palace. Because of that, Elijah structured his entire estate to ensure you would never have to rely on anyone else ever again." I looked down at the document. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for the bottom line. I expected a modest life insurance policy, maybe $50,000 to help with Trey and Aaliyah's college tuition. Mr. Sterling did not wait for me to decipher the text. He delivered the blow that completely shattered my reality. "Your uncle has left you a fully liquidated trust," he stated clearly. "All taxes have been prepaid by the estate. The funds are cleared and sitting in a private tier account, solely in your name. The total liquid amount is $25 million. The room started to spin. A loud ringing noise filled my ears, drowning out the hum of the city traffic far below. I gripped the edges of the heavy mahogany table, anchoring myself so I would not physically collapse out of the leather chair. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My brain short-circuited, entirely unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the number. $25 million. I stared at Mr. Sterling, waiting for him to laugh or correct himself. I waited for the punchline of a cruel joke, but his expression remained completely professional, completely serious. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of euphoria crash into my chest, stealing the breath directly from my lungs. The transition from being a financial hostage to a multimillionaire happened in the span of 3 seconds. Just 24 hours ago, I was sitting on the floor of my dark closet counting crumpled bills from a hollowed-out dictionary just to afford a train ticket. Just 24 hours ago, my husband slammed a meager grocery allowance on the kitchen counter and called me a leech. Terrence used his mid-level corporate salary to hold my basic dignity hostage. He thought making $90,000 a year gave him the right to crush my spirit and treat me like a worthless dependent. Now, as I sat in that silent Manhattan boardroom looking at a piece of paper that confirmed my unbelievable new reality, I realized I could buy Terrence's entire corporate firm and fire him before lunch. The psychological chains that had bound me to a toxic, abusive marriage snapped and dissolved into dust. I was no longer trapped. I was no longer dependent on a man who despised me. I was completely, utterly, and flawlessly free. Tears spilled over my eyelashes and rolled down my cheeks. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of absolute liberation. The crushing weight I had carried on my shoulders for 7 years vanished, leaving me lightheaded and breathless. Uncle Elijah had seen my silent suffering. He had seen the financial abuse I endured to keep my children safe. And with a single stroke of a pen, he had reached beyond the grave to hand me an impenetrable fortress. Mr. Sterling handed me a linen handkerchief and waited patiently for my breathing to steady. "Take your time, Jasmine," he said softly. "I know it is a monumental shock." I wiped my face and sat up straight. The scared, submissive wife who had boarded the train at Penn Station was dead. A new woman took her place right there in that leather chair. I looked at the lawyer with crystal clear vision and a steady beating heart. "I am okay, Mr. Sterling. I said, my voice stronger than it had been in a decade. I am perfectly okay. He smiled and turned to the next page in the thick portfolio. Good, he replied, because the liquid trust is only the first part of your inheritance. We still need to discuss the real estate portfolio. Mr. Sterling turned in the thick parchment page and produced a glossy aerial photograph of a towering 30-story commercial building. Its glass facade reflected the bustling energy of Midtown Manhattan. He placed the photograph between us along with a heavy stack of notarized deeds. I stared at the image, trying to connect the magnificent skyscraper to the man who used to brew peppermint tea on a chipped electric stove. This is the crown jewel of your uncle's commercial portfolio, Mr. Sterling explained, his voice carrying a note of profound respect. It is a fully tenanted Class A office building located just blocks from Times Square. It houses international tech firms' corporate law offices and a luxury retail space on the ground floor. The property is completely unencumbered and generates a massive continuous stream of passive income. As of this morning, the deed is entirely in your name, Jasmine. You own the skyline. I reached out and touched the glossy photograph, my fingers trembling slightly. The sheer scale of what Uncle Elijah had built in the shadows was breathtaking. He had navigated a world designed to keep black men out, and he had quietly conquered it. I thought about all the times Terrence and his brother Malik had mocked Elijah, calling him a cautionary tale. If they only knew that the man they ridiculed could have bought their entire corporate finance firm with a single month's rent from one of his tenants. But the surprises were not over. Mr. Sterling closed the main portfolio and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a smaller, unassuming blue folder. His professional demeanor softened, shifting into something far more personal and grave. He placed his hands flat on the table and looked me directly in the eyes. Your uncle was a fiercely protective man, Jasmine, Mr. Sterling said. He saw the reality of your marriage long before you ever had to say a word. He knew exactly what kind of man Terrence was. And because of that, Elijah took certain precautions to ensure that you and your children would never end up on the street. I frowned, confused by his sudden shift in tone. What do you mean? I asked. Terrence is controlling, but he is a finance manager. He prides himself on his credit score and his investments. He handles all our mortgage payments. Mr. Sterling let out a heavy sigh and opened the blue folder. 5 years ago, your husband made a catastrophic financial gamble. He leveraged your home in Atlanta to funnel money into a highly volatile shadow investment. When the market turned, Terrence lost everything. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on your family home. He hid the notices from you, Jasmine. You and your children were exactly 3 weeks away from being physically locked out of your house. My blood ran cold. 5 years ago, I was pregnant with Aaliyah. I vividly remembered Terrence being unusually volatile during that time, screaming at me for buying premium diapers for Trey, and blaming his stress on a sudden influx of corporate audits at work. He was not stressed about work. He was hiding the fact that he had gambled away the roof over my babies' heads to feed his own ego. I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach. How did we not lose the house? I whispered. Terrence told me he secured a brilliant refinancing deal through a private firm. He bragged about it for months, claiming his corporate connections saved us a fortune in interest rates. Mr. Sterling shook his head. There was no brilliant refinancing deal. Elijah had retained private investigators to keep an eye on your well-being. When he discovered the foreclosure notices, he bypassed Terrence completely. Elijah deployed an anonymous subsidiary holding company called the Harlem Rose Group. Through that corporate entity, your uncle bought the debt and the deed directly from the bank. He paid it off in full in cash. I sat frozen, absorbing the absolute magnitude of the lawyer's words. Terrence thought he was dealing with an obscure private equity firm, Mr. Sterling continued. The lawyers we hired structured a payment plan that allowed Terrence to believe he was paying down a new mortgage. But in reality, Terrence has been paying rent to your uncle's LLC for the past 5 years. He does not own a single brick of that house. The lawyer slid the final piece of paper across the mahogany table. It was the deed to the beautiful 4-bedroom home in Atlanta, where I had raised my children and endured years of relentless psychological abuse. As the sole beneficiary of the Harlem Rose Group, Mr. Sterling said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, You legally own the property free and clear. Terrence has zero equity. He is effectively your tenant, Jasmine. You hold the keys to the castle. I stared at the deed, my name printed clearly in bold black ink. A profound, earth-shattering realization of absolute power washed over me. Terrence had spent years breaking my spirit, using his paycheck as a weapon to make me feel small. He paraded around our home like a king demanding submission because he was the sole provider. He allowed his arrogant sister-in-law, Lauren, to disrespect me at family dinners because I did not bring home a corporate salary. He called me a leech. He told me I was a financial burden dragging him down. And the entire time, this arrogant, boastful man was nothing more than a tenant living in a house owned by the very woman he abused. The home he claimed he provided for us was a charitable donation from the crazy old man he relentlessly mocked. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The tears of shock had completely dried up, replaced by a burning, brilliant fire. I picked up a heavy gold pen from the center of the boardroom table and signed the final transfer documents, cementing my empire. I thanked Mr. Sterling, shaking his hand with a newfound, unbreakable confidence. I gathered my legal folders, tucked them safely into my tote bag, and walked out of that skyscraper a completely reborn woman. I had $25 million in the bank, a commercial empire in Manhattan, and the ultimate trump card waiting for me back in Atlanta. Terrence thought he held all the power, but he was about to learn a brutal lesson about what happens when you corner a queen in her own castle. The journey back to Atlanta felt like floating, suspended in a surreal, gravity-defying dream. I sat by the window of the train, hugging my worn leather tote bag tightly against my chest. Inside that bag rested a heavy legal portfolio containing $25 million in liquid assets, the deed to a commercial skyscraper in Manhattan, and the absolute unencumbered ownership of my own home. The sheer weight of that reality should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like breathing pure oxygen after drowning underwater for 7 years. I watched the eastern seaboard blur past the glass, and for the first time in a decade, my mind was not consumed by a chaotic running tally of unpaid bills and overdue utility notices. As the miles disappeared behind me, a profound and dangerously naive sense of hope began to bloom in my chest. Armed with the shocking revelation of Terrence and his secret financial ruin from 5 years ago, my heart did something incredibly foolish. It forgave him. I sat in my seat and actively rewrote the entire narrative of my abusive marriage. That is exactly what victims of emotional abuse do. We search for any logical excuse to explain why the person who promised to protect us is treating us like an enemy. Terrence was not a monster, I told myself. He was simply a man who was crumbling under the unbearable weight of a massive secret. He had almost lost our family home, and the silent shame of that failure must have been eating him alive every single day. That was why he lashed out at me. That was why he called me a leech and controlled the grocery money with an iron fist. He was terrified. He was projecting his own deep-seated financial insecurities onto his wife. But now I held the ultimate cure for his stress. I pictured the exact moment I would lay those legal documents on our kitchen island. I imagined the look of sheer disbelief on his face when I told him the crushing corporate debt he had been paying off for 5 years was entirely, completely gone. I envisioned the tight, rigid tension melting from his shoulders when he realized we were not just financially stable, but independently wealthy beyond his wildest corporate finance dreams. He could finally quit the firm that overworked and underappreciated him. We could finally take that family vacation to the Caribbean we always talked about before the kids were born. We could be real partners again. The toxic power dynamic would instantly evaporate, washed away by a tidal wave of $25 million. The late afternoon sun was casting a warm golden glow over Atlanta when I finally arrived at the elementary school to pick up Trey and Aaliyah from their aftercare program. When I walked through the double doors of the cafeteria, my children dropped their crayons and ran toward me, their backpacks bouncing awkwardly against their small shoulders. I dropped to my knees right there on the linoleum floor and pulled them both into a tight, fierce embrace. I breathed in the familiar scent of their strawberry shampoo and construction paper. They giggled, complaining that I was squeezing them too hard, but I simply could not let go. I looked at Trey's worn-out sneakers and Aaliyah's slightly faded uniform dress. I wanted to shout to the entire cafeteria that their world had just profoundly changed. I wanted to whisper that Mommy could finally afford the expensive summer coding camp for Trey and the elite ballet academy Aaliyah had been begging to join. But I kept the wonderful secret locked safely behind my bright smile. Tonight was not about spoiling the kids with toys. Tonight was about healing their parents and fixing our family as a whole. I strapped them into the back seat of my older sedan and started the drive back to our suburban neighborhood. The radio was playing a soft, upbeat rhythm, and the kids were chattering excitedly about a science project involving baking soda volcanoes. I glanced at them through the rearview mirror, my heart swelling with an overwhelming fierce love. Everything was going to be perfect. The financial chains that had suffocated our household were permanently broken. The dark, heavy cloud of resentment that hovered over their father would finally lift. We were going to be a happy, normal family again. As I turned onto our familiar tree-lined street, I felt a nervous flutter of anticipation in my stomach. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, rehearsing exactly what I would say to my husband. I would not gloat. I would not throw his past disrespect in his face or demand an apology for the times he made me cry. I would approach him with grace and unwavering partnership. I practiced the words in my head. Terrence, the struggle is over. Uncle Elijah saved us. We never have to worry about money again. I turned on my blinker and guided the car into our driveway. The late afternoon shadows stretched long and peaceful across our manicured lawn. Terrence's leased luxury sedan was already parked near the garage, which meant he had come home early from the finance firm. My heart did a happy little leap. This timing was absolutely perfect. The kids could play safely in the fenced backyard while Terrence and I sat down in the living room for the most important conversation of our entire lives. I put the car in park, turned off the ignition, and took a deep, steadying breath. I grabbed my leather tote bag, holding it close to my side, like a protective shield of pure optimism. I unbuckled the kids and we began walking up the paved driveway together, hand in hand. I was completely consumed by the beautiful, radiant fantasy of saving my marriage and healing my husband. I had absolutely no idea that I was walking my innocent children directly into a meticulously planned and flawlessly executed ambush. As we approached the bottom of the brick walkway, the heavy wooden front door swung open before I could even reach into my pocket for my keys. Terrence stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, but his tie was loosened and his jacket was unbuttoned. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him the miraculous news that would change our destiny, but the words completely vanished from my throat. Terrence did not have the exhausted, stressed demeanor of an overworked finance manager. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, and his face set in a mask of cold, absolute resolve. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, calculating detachment. Then a second figure stepped out of the shadows of the foyer and stood right beside my husband. It was Vanessa. I recognized her instantly from the photos on the corporate firm website and the brief glimpses I had caught on Terrence's phone. She was 29 years old, wearing a sleek beige trench coat over a designer silk blouse, and her hair was blown out into perfect voluminous waves. She stood on my front porch with an air of sickening entitlement, crossing her arms and looking down at me with a smirk that made my blood run ice cold. Her presence at my home felt like a violent physical blow. This was the junior analyst who needed mentoring at midnight. This was the woman Terrence had sworn was just a needy coworker. My brain struggled to process the visual information in front of me. I instinctively squeezed the hands of my children, pulling them slightly behind my legs. Trey and Aaliyah immediately stopped their excited chatter. Children always sense when the atmosphere shifts from safe to dangerous. Aaliyah pressed her small face against my thigh, her fingers gripping the fabric of my skirt. I looked from Vanessa back to Terrence, trying to formulate a rational explanation for why his mistress was standing in the doorway of our family home. But before I could ask a single question, my gaze dropped to the top of the porch steps. Lined up in a neat row were 3 large suitcases. They were not Terrence's sleek black luggage. They were the vintage floral suitcases my mother had given me when I went off to college. Beside them sat a cardboard box overflowing with my graphic design portfolios, a few framed photos from my home office, and my favorite winter coats. I stared at the luggage, feeling the ground beneath my feet begin to tilt. My beautifully constructed fantasy of saving my marriage, of using Uncle Elijah's millions to heal my family, completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Terrence had not been stressing over financial burdens or carrying the heavy weight of providing for our family. He had been meticulously planning my exit. While I was in New York mourning the death of the only person who truly loved me, Terrence was actively packing up my life and moving his mistress into my sanctuary. Terrence did not flinch. He did not show an ounce of remorse or shame as he looked at his 8-year-old son and his 6-year-old daughter standing on the driveway. He walked slowly down the porch steps, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete. In his right hand, he held a thick manila envelope. He stopped just 2 feet away from me. He did not ask about my trip to Manhattan. He did not ask how I was doing after attending a formal will reading for a deceased family member. He simply extended his arm and shoved the envelope directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. "I am filing for divorce, Jasmine," he said, his voice loud and steady enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "I had my lawyer draft the papers this morning. You need to sign them by Monday." I looked down at the thick envelope in my hands. The heavy legal portfolio containing my $25 million inheritance was strapped to my shoulder, but my fingers were now wrapped around the termination of my marriage. I looked up at Terrence, searching his eyes for any trace of the man I had vowed to love for the rest of my life. There was nothing there but arrogant contempt. "You are doing this right now?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, as I tried to keep the children shielded from the devastation unfolding on our front lawn. "You are doing this in front of Trey and Aaliyah." Terrence scoffed and shook his head. "Do not try to use the kids to manipulate the situation, Jasmine. This is happening because I am done carrying dead weight. I am done being the only adult in this relationship who actually contributes to our survival. I have spent years funding your little design projects and supporting your lifestyle while getting nothing in return. I want a partner who actually brings something to the table. I want someone who operates on my level." He gestured back toward the porch where Vanessa was standing tall, displaying a look of absolute triumph. "Vanessa is moving in," he declared without a single ounce of hesitation. "We are building a future together. You have been holding me back for far too long, and I am finally cutting my losses." I stood frozen on the driveway, listening to the man I had spent the entire train ride home making excuses for. I had spent hours convincing myself that his cruelty was just a byproduct of financial stress. I had been ready to hand him a life of unimaginable luxury, to forgive him for calling me a leech, to wipe away his secret corporate debt. I was ready to save him. But Terrence did not want to be saved. He wanted to destroy me. He wanted to humiliate me in broad daylight, discarding me like trash on the curb while he paraded his new younger corporate partner in my face. He timed this ambush perfectly, assuming I would return from New York broken, empty-handed, and entirely dependent on his mercy. He wanted to watch me beg. Vanessa did not stay on the porch. She walked down the brick steps with a slow, deliberate sway, her expensive trench coat catching the late afternoon breeze. She stopped right next to Terrence, wrapping her arm through his with a sickening display of ownership. She looked at my children with a brief expression of distaste before locking her eyes onto mine. She smiled, that same arrogant smirk I had seen in corporate offices 1,000 times before. The kind of smile worn by people who believe their paycheck makes them untouchable. "Pack your bags," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "This house has no room for a leech." I stared at her, letting her words hang in the heavy air between us. She had incredible nerve. A 29-year-old junior analyst standing on the driveway of a home I had spent 7 years turning into a sanctuary, telling me I was taking up space. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the vintage floral suitcases sitting on the steps. "Terrence has been carrying you for almost a decade," Vanessa continued, her tone completely devoid of human decency. "It is honestly pathetic. You sit around doing arts and crafts while he works 90-hour weeks to keep the lights on. He deserves a partner who actually contributes. He deserves a woman who brings a six-figure salary to the table, not someone who begs for grocery money. Instead of checking his mistress for speaking to the mother of his children with such profound disrespect, Terrence nodded in absolute agreement. He puffed out his chest, looking at me as if I were a pest infesting his lawn. "Vanessa is right, Jasmine," he declared, his voice harsh and uncompromising. "You need to gather your boxes and leave my property immediately. I am not giving you another night under my roof. I have completely outgrown you." I need a woman who understands corporate strategy, who knows how to build real wealth. Vanessa and I speak the same language. We are building an empire together, and I cannot have you dragging down my financial momentum anymore. My financial momentum. The absolute hypocrisy of his statement almost made me laugh aloud. But Terrence was not finished. He wanted to make sure the knife was twisted as deeply as possible. He wanted to ensure my spirit was entirely broken before he kicked me to the curb. "We have been together for 6 months," Terrence confessed, crossing his arms over his chest. "All those late-night finance emergencies you were too naive to question. All those weekend retreats for corporate team building. We were together, Jasmine. I was taking Vanessa to 5-star restaurants downtown and booking luxury suites at the Ritz while you were at home clipping coupons and stressing over the electricity bill." Vanessa leaned her head against Terrence's shoulder, looking at me with cold pity. "He bought me this coat for my birthday," she boasted lightly, running her hand down the beige fabric. "He took me to Miami for Valentine's Day." Do you really think a man like Terrence wants to come home to a tired housewife, covered in paint and smelling like cheap cooking oil? He is a provider, Jasmine, but he wants to provide for someone who matches his value. You do not match his value. You never did. You are a financial liability. Every cruel syllable they spoke felt like a physical strike, but I did not react. I could feel Trey and Aaliyah trembling behind my legs. My sweet, innocent children were being forced to listen to their father brag about dismantling their family for a younger woman. Terrence did not care about the psychological damage he was inflicting on his own son and daughter. He was too consumed by his own arrogance, too drunk on the power he thought he held over me. He genuinely believed that by humiliating me in front of the kids, he was asserting his dominance as the supreme patriarch. "I have already transferred my primary direct deposits to a new private account." Terrence continued, pulling a set of car keys from his pocket and jingling them aggressively. "I left exactly $300 in the joint checking account. That should be enough for you to rent a cheap motel room for a few nights while you figure out your life. I am not paying for your transition. I am not funding your exit. You wanted to be a freelance artist so badly. Well, now is your chance to see how far those little drawings will actually get you in the real world. Take your bags and get off my driveway before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." He was throwing me out with $300 to my name. He was actively trying to render me homeless with 2 young children right as the sun was beginning to set. He had spent the last 6 months blowing thousands of dollars on luxury vacations and designer gifts for a junior analyst, while forcing me to take on low-paying design gigs just to buy our children winter coats. The sheer evil of his calculated betrayal was staggering. He had orchestrated this moment down to the very last detail, hoping to watch me drop to my knees and beg him to let me stay. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to scream and throw a chaotic tantrum so Vanessa could look at him and validate his choice to leave his crazy, unstable wife. He wanted to prove that I was nothing without his corporate salary. But the tears never came. The panic never materialized. As I stood there listening to them list the extensive details of their 6-month affair, feeling the hard edges of the legal portfolio resting heavily inside my leather tote bag, an icy wave of absolute calm washed over my entire body. They were standing on the steps of a house they thought they controlled. They were lecturing me about building real wealth and bringing financial value to the table. They had absolutely no idea who they were talking to. Terrence and Vanessa stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, waiting for my complete mental collapse. They expected me to drop to my knees on the concrete driveway and beg for my marriage. They wanted tears and hysteria. They wanted a chaotic, unhinged reaction that would perfectly validate Terrence leaving his supposedly unstable wife for a younger, sophisticated corporate partner. Instead, I broke eye contact with my husband and looked down at my two children. Trey was squeezing his eyes shut, trying hard not to cry, while Aaliyah buried her small face into the fabric of my skirt. My maternal instinct instantly overrode any shock or residual pain. My babies were not going to be audience members to this grotesque performance. I knelt down on the pavement, completely ignoring the two arrogant adults standing on my porch. I spoke to my children in a soft, steady voice, telling them everything was perfectly fine and that Mommy had everything under control. I took their small hands in mine, stood up, and turned my back on Terrence and Vanessa. I walked Trey and Aaliyah down the driveway toward my older model sedan parked by the curb. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of our quiet suburban neighborhood, making the entire horrific scene feel bizarrely peaceful. I opened the rear doors and buckled both children securely into their car seats. From my tote bag, I pulled out the heavy-duty noise-canceling headphones they used for long road trips and placed them gently over their ears. I handed Trey my backup tablet and pulled up their favorite animated movie, turning the brightness up to hold their attention. I leaned in close, tapped the side of my head to signal they should keep the headphones on, and gave them a bright, reassuring smile. I promised I would be right back. Closing the heavy car doors, I sealed them in an impenetrable bubble of safety. Effectively cutting off Terrence and his cruel voice from their reality, they were protected. Now I could finally deal with the threat standing on my front lawn. Turning around to face the house, I felt a profound physical transformation taking place inside my body. Every single ounce of the naive, hopeful wife who had boarded that train in Manhattan earlier today simply evaporated into the cooling evening air. The woman who spent 7 long years trying to shrink herself to fit into Terrence and his fragile ego died right there on the pavement. The intense grief I thought I would feel over the absolute death of my marriage never arrived. It was instantly consumed by a blinding, razor-sharp focus. Terrence had not just cheated on me. He had weaponized our family finances to fund a secret double life. He had used the money meant for our survival to wine and dine a junior analyst in luxury hotels, and then he deliberately attempted to throw me out on the street with exactly $300 to my name. He wanted to leave the mother of his children utterly destitute just to impress a woman who wore a beige trench coat paid for by my financial suffering. He wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would never be able to stand back up. As I walked slowly back up the driveway, my leather tote bag secured firmly over my shoulder, I analyzed the two people waiting on my porch. From my new vantage point, they looked incredibly foolish. Terrence stood with his chest puffed out, holding the manila envelope of divorce papers, like a championship trophy, genuinely believing he held the winning hand. Vanessa leaned against the wooden railing wearing a triumphant grin, completely convinced she had secured a wealthy, successful corporate provider. They had spent 6 months weaving a grand illusion where I was the dead weight dragging down their bright, prosperous future. They had meticulously orchestrated this ambush to maximize my humiliation and establish their dominance. But their entire reality was built on a crumbling foundation of absolute lies and hidden corporate debt. Terrence was a fraud. He was a financially ruined man, playing dress-up in tailored suits, trying to impress a woman who only wanted him for the paycheck he barely possessed. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his secret foreclosure from 5 years ago had legally stripped him of all his power. I stepped onto the first brick step of the porch. The air between us was thick with tension, but my lungs were pulling in deep, even breaths of perfect clarity. Terrence frowned clearly, unsettled by my chilling lack of hysteria. Predators expect their prey to panic. When the prey simply stares back with cold calculation, the predator gets confused. Terrence shifted his weight, his arrogant posture faltering for just a fraction of a second. He held the manila envelope out toward me again, loudly demanding I take the divorce papers. He reiterated his command, telling me to grab my old vintage suitcases and vacate the premises before he lost his temper and called law enforcement to remove me. Vanessa chimed in again, crossing her arms and letting out a condescending sigh. She told me I was embarrassing myself by sticking around where I was clearly unwanted. She told me to take my little $300 and go find a cheap motel room before it got too dark outside. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or attack her character. I did not even look at the cheap vintage luggage they had so carefully packed and placed on the steps to demean me. I looked directly into Terrence, and his eyes piercing straight through his fake corporate facade to the cowardly, insecure man hiding beneath. I felt the heavy weight of Uncle Elijah and his legal portfolio pressing against my side. That thick stack of documents represented $25 million, a commercial Manhattan skyscraper, and the undeniable legally binding ownership of the very ground Terrence was currently standing on. He had spent years demanding a partner who brought real wealth to the table. He constantly bragged about wanting a woman who operated on his level and understood how to build an empire. He was about to find out that I was operating in a stratosphere he could not even begin to comprehend, and that his entire existence was entirely at my mercy. I reached out and took the thick manila envelope containing the divorce papers from Terrence. He smirked clearly, believing my silent compliance was a sign of ultimate defeat. I did not open it. I simply turned and dropped the envelope onto the small wrought iron patio table resting between the porch columns. Terrence let out a short, arrogant breath, crossing his arms and waiting for me to grab my floral suitcases. Instead, I unzipped my heavy leather tote bag. The metal teeth of the zipper cut loudly through the quiet suburban air. I reached inside my fingers, brushing past my wallet, and finding the thick, pristine legal portfolio I had carried all the way from Midtown Manhattan. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the patio table right next to his pathetic divorce papers. "What is that?" Terrence demanded, his voice laced with sharp irritation. "Are those your little freelance invoices? I told you, I am not paying for your transition, Jasmine. You are wasting my time." Vanessa shifted her weight, adjusting the belt of her expensive beige trench coat. "Just call the police, Terrence," she sighed, rolling her eyes dramatically. She is stalling. She probably wants to beg for her grocery allowance one last time so she can afford a cheap motel room. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on my husband, ignoring his mistress completely. "Terrence," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level, "do you remember 5 years ago when you came home and told me you scored a brilliant corporate refinancing deal for this house? You bragged for months about how your firm connections saved us from a fluctuating interest rate. You told my family you were a financial genius for securing such an airtight mortgage structure." Terrence's brow furrowed, his confident posture stiffened just a fraction. A flicker of something that looked a lot like sudden panic darted across his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a deep scowl. "What does our mortgage have to do with you getting off my property?" he snapped. "Stop talking in riddles, Jasmine, and leave." "It has everything to do with it," I replied, resting my hand on the smooth leather cover of the portfolio. "Because 5 years ago, there was no brilliant corporate refinancing deal. You were not negotiating interest rates. You were hiding the devastating fact that you leveraged our family home to fund a disastrous shadow investment. You lost everything, Terrence. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. You and I were exactly 3 weeks away from being physically locked out of this house with a newborn baby and a toddler." Terrence's face drained of all color. The arrogant sneer vanished completely, wiped away by sudden absolute terror. He took a half step back, his mouth opening but failing to form a single word. Vanessa looked at him, her perfectly drawn eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. "Terrence, what is she talking about?" Vanessa asked, her voice losing its arrogant edge. "You told me you put a massive down payment on this property." "He did not put down a single dime." I continued, flipping open the heavy leather cover of the portfolio. I pulled out the crisp, notarized documents bearing the letterhead of Sterling, Montgomery, and Pierce. "He lost the property entirely, Vanessa. The bank took it. But we did not end up on the street because an anonymous private equity firm stepped in at the 11th hour. A holding company called the Harlem Rose Group. They bought the debt. They bought the deed directly from the bank, paid in full with cold, hard cash." I slid the heavily stamped documents across the glass surface of the patio table. Terrence stared at the papers as if they were venomous snakes preparing to strike. He knew exactly what the Harlem Rose Group was. It was the name on the wire transfers he scheduled on the first of every single month. You have been paying the Harlem Rose Group for 5 years, Terrence, I stated, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. You thought they were an obscure corporate lender who bailed you out to save your fragile ego. You thought you were paying down a newly structured mortgage. But you were not building equity. You were paying rent. You are not a homeowner, Terrence. You are a tenant. You have been a tenant in this house for half a decade. That is a lie, Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He lunged forward, snatching the documents off the table. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, his hands physically shaking as he read the irrefutable proof of his own financial ruin. It is a holding company, he stammered, a heavy bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. I pay the mortgage to them. I have the receipts. I own this house. You own absolutely nothing, I corrected softly, reaching back into the portfolio. I pulled out the final document, the original pristine deed to the property, bearing the fresh embossed seals from the State Records Office. The Harlem Rose Group was a subsidiary LLC created by my great-uncle Elijah, the same crazy, broke old man you mocked at every family dinner, the same man whose funeral you refused to let me attend. He bought this house to protect my children from your reckless financial gambling. I slid the deed across the table, stopping it right in front of Vanessa's designer handbag. She looked down at the thick black ink printed across the top of the page. And since Uncle Elijah passed away 2 days ago, I continued keeping my gaze locked on Terrence's horrified face, the sole ownership of the Harlem Rose Group and all of its assets transferred directly to his primary beneficiary. I tapped my fingernail twice against the deed right above the line where my full legal name was printed in undeniable bold letters. The silence on the porch was deafening. The only sound was the rustle of the wind blowing through the maple trees in the front yard. Terrence stood completely paralyzed, holding the foreclosure records while his mistress stared at the deed, proving her wealthy provider was completely destitute. Vanessa leaned over the wrought iron patio table, her perfectly manicured fingernails hovering just inches above the crisp white document. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between my name printed in heavy black ink and the undeniable seal of the State Records Office. The smug, triumphant sneer that had been plastered across her face just moments ago began to slip, replaced by a twitch of profound confusion. She looked at Terrence, expecting him to snatch the paper away and declare it a forgery. She expected the wealthy, powerful corporate finance manager she had been sleeping with to assert his dominance and put his hysterical wife back in her place. But Terrence was entirely mute. He was staring at the foreclosure documents I had handed him earlier, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. I shifted my gaze from my husband and locked eyes directly with his mistress. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I wanted her to hear the words clearly. I wanted them to echo in her mind every single time she looked at the man standing beside her. Actually, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, razor-sharp whisper, "This house is mine." The exact moment the reality of my statement registered in Vanessa's brain was a masterpiece of human reaction. I watched in absolute fascination as the warm sun-kissed color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. She physically recoiled from the table, taking a stumbling step backward, as if the deed itself were radioactive. The expensive beige trench coat she had flaunted just 10 minutes ago suddenly looked like a ridiculous costume. She had orchestrated this entire afternoon, packing my bags and standing on my porch, fully believing she was walking into a luxury suburban estate, paid for by her high-earning boyfriend. Now she was staring at the devastating truth. She had not hitched her wagon to a wealthy provider. She had tied herself to a financially ruined fraud who was actively paying rent to his own wife. Terrence finally snapped out of his paralyzed trance. "No!" He barked, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate edge that I had never heard before. "No, this is a trick. This is a setup." He lunged for the deed, snatching it off the table with trembling, clammy hands. He held the paper up to the fading sunlight, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs with frantic urgency. He was searching for a loophole, a typo, a missing signature, or anything that would invalidate the absolute destruction of his ego. He flipped to the second page, then the third, reading the transfer of assets from the Harlem Rose Group directly into my primary trust. "Look closely, Terrence," I instructed, crossing my arms over my chest and watching him unravel. "Check the notarized seals. Check the signatures from the partners at Sterling, Montgomery, and Pierce. You work in corporate finance. You know exactly what a watertight legal transfer looks like. There are no loopholes. You have zero equity in this property. You do not own the roof over your head. You do not own the driveway you are standing on. You are a tenant in my kingdom." "This cannot be legal," he gasped, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled. "I paid the mortgage. I transferred the funds from my salary every single month for 5 years. I built the equity." "You paid rent," I corrected sharply, refusing to let him cling to his delusions for a second longer. "You paid rent to a holding company that was protecting my children from your catastrophic financial negligence. You gambled away our security, and my uncle bought your debt to keep my babies off the street. You built zero equity, Terrence. You simply covered the cost of occupying a space that belonged to my family. And now that space belongs entirely to me." Terrence frantically shuffled through the foreclosure notices I had provided, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He was comparing the dates on the bank notices from 5 years ago to the establishment dates of the LLC. I could physically see the mathematical calculations clicking together in his brain. The numbers were undeniable. He had been completely outplayed by the very man he had mocked at every family dinner. Great Uncle Elijah had trapped him in a financial web so brilliantly disguised that Terrence had willingly funded my inheritance without ever knowing the truth. The power dynamic on that porch inverted so rapidly and violently, it felt like a gravitational shift. For 7 years, Terrence had used his paycheck as a weapon. He had diminished my creative labor, restricted my access to basic household funds, and demanded absolute submission because he claimed he was the sole provider. He had spent the last 6 months blowing his meager disposable income on luxury hotels and designer gifts for a junior analyst fully convinced he held all the cards. Now his entire identity was obliterated. The corporate king was dead stripped of his crown and his castle by the wife he had mercilessly degraded. Vanessa looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and mounting disgust. "Terrence," she demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you own this house." Terrence could not even look at her. He dropped his gaze to the concrete floor of the porch, his shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of his own exposure. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of a toxic, abusive man realizing he had absolutely nothing left. "He cannot tell you that, Vanessa," I said, stepping forward and reclaiming my space on my front porch. "Because he has nothing. He has no house. He has no assets. He has a pile of secret debt and a leased luxury car that he can barely afford." I reached out and calmly plucked the legal documents from Terrence's weak, unresisting grip. I tapped them against the patio table, aligning the edges with meticulous precision before sliding them safely back into my heavy leather tote bag. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, and looked down at the 2 people who had planned to break my spirit today. The victim they were hoping to destroy was gone. I was the master of this estate, and it was time to clean house. Terrence stood rooted to the concrete, his entire corporate facade completely dismantled. I pointed to the manila envelope resting on the patio table. "You served me those divorce papers today, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You initiated the legal dissolution of this marriage. Because your name does not exist anywhere on the deed of this property, and because you are the one filing for separation, the law is incredibly clear. You are officially a tenant who has initiated a change in marital status. I am giving you your formal verbal notice right now. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your tailored suits, your luxury watches, and whatever dignity you have left. After 30 days, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you." He blinked rapidly, trying to process the timeline. 30 days, he repeated, his voice hollow and weak. "Jasmine, wait. We do not have to rush this. We can sit down and talk. Maybe I was too hasty with the paperwork. We have a family." I held up my hand, silencing him instantly. Do not you dare invoke the family you just tried to destroy. You made your choice. You chose to try and leave the mother of your children destitute on the street. The 30-day countdown began the second you shoved that envelope against my chest. I then turned my attention entirely to Vanessa. She was clutching her designer handbag, her knuckles white, her eyes darting toward Terrence's leased car as if mapping out an immediate escape route. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The arrogance that had radiated from her when she told me to pack my bags was completely gone. It was replaced by the panicked realization that she had just ruined a marriage for a man who could not even afford his own mortgage. "And as for you, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone icy and precise, "you are not a spouse, you are not a tenant, you have absolutely no legal right to be standing on my front porch, you are trespassing on private property owned by a multi-million-dollar trust." She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some pathetic excuse or to beg for a moment to gather her composure, but I did not give her the chance. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and held it up, my thumb hovering directly over the screen. "You have exactly 10 seconds to walk your expensive beige trench coat down my driveway and step off my property. If you are still standing on my concrete when I count to 10, I am dialing 911 and having you arrested for criminal trespassing." Vanessa looked at Terrence silently, pleading with him to defend her, to assert his dominance and protect her from the wrath of a betrayed wife. But Terrence was completely emasculated. He could not even meet her gaze. He stared down at his Italian leather shoes, the reality of his financial ruin, crushing any impulse he had to play the hero. And I started counting, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet suburban evening. 9, 8. Vanessa did not wait for 7. She spun around her high heels, stumbling slightly on the brick steps, and practically ran down the driveway. She did not look back. She did not ask Terrence to follow her. She abandoned him the exact same way he had tried to abandon me. I watched her hurry down the sidewalk, pulling her phone from her pocket, likely to call an expensive rideshare back to her tiny apartment. The glamorous future she had envisioned had evaporated into thin air. 7. I continued looking back at Terrence. 6, 5. Terrence snapped out of his daze, his hands reaching out in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Jasmine, please do not do this. I have nowhere else to go. I cannot afford a new place right now. My accounts are tied up in investments. We need to talk." 4. I said, stepping past him and picking up the manila envelope containing the divorce papers. 3. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at my vintage floral suitcases, sitting exactly where he had placed them to humiliate me. I reached down, grabbed the handles, and effortlessly carried my own luggage back onto my porch. Terrence scrambled out of my way, moving like a frightened animal. 2. I said softly. I walked down the steps one last time, making my way to the older model sedan parked by the curb. I opened the rear doors and smiled warmly at Trey and Aliyah. They took off their noise-canceling headphones, their eyes full of innocent curiosity. I unbuckled them, held their small hands in mine, and guided them up the brick walkway. Terrence tried to reach out to his children, his face twisted in a mask of sudden, devastating regret. I stepped between him and my babies, shielding them from his toxic presence. I guided my children up the steps and walked them directly to the front door. I pulled my keys from my pocket and slid the familiar brass key into the lock. It clicked, loudly echoing on the porch. I ushered Trey and Aliyah inside the warm, brightly lit foyer, telling them to run along to the kitchen and wash their hands for dinner. I stood in the doorway and turned back to face my husband one final time. He was standing on the porch, completely alone, stripped of his mistress, his pride, and his financial leverage. The arrogant corporate finance manager, who had called me a leech, was now standing outside my castle, staring at a queen who held all the power. "One," I whispered. I stepped inside my beautiful home, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and slammed the front door directly in his face. I engaged the deadbolt, turning the lock with a satisfying, heavy click. I leaned against the sturdy wood, taking a deep breath of the quiet, peaceful air inside my sanctuary. The war was far from over, but the hardest battle had been decisively won. I was safe. My children were safe. And Terrence was finally locked out in the cold. The morning after I locked Terrence out of my house, the sun rose with a brilliant, blinding clarity. I woke up in my own bed completely alone, and for the first time in 7 years, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. I walked downstairs to a silent kitchen. There was no arrogant husband demanding to know why the coffee was not brewing. There were no snide remarks about my freelance income. I made breakfast for Trey and Aaliyah, packed their lunchboxes with extra treats, and drove them to school with the radio playing their favorite songs. They did not ask where their father was. Children are incredibly perceptive. They thrive in peaceful environments, and the suffocating tension that usually poisoned our morning routine had completely vanished. After dropping them off, I did not return home to work on low-paying graphic design commissions. I drove my older sedan directly to the upscale financial district in Buckhead. I had spent the previous evening doing meticulous research. I did not need a mediator or a friendly family lawyer who specialized in amicable splits. I needed a shark. I needed a legal assassin who understood exactly how to dismantle a financially abusive spouse. My search led me to Valerie Chambers, an aggressive, highly respected African-American divorce attorney known for utterly destroying opposing counsel in high-asset litigations. Walking into her sleek, modern office on the 20th floor, I felt a profound shift in my posture. I was no longer the submissive housewife begging for grocery money. I was a multi-millionaire preparing to go to war. I sat in a plush leather chair across from Valerie, a sharp-eyed woman wearing a tailored crimson suit, and laid my documents on her glass desk. I did not cry. I did not give her a dramatic, emotional monologue. I handed her the divorce papers Terrence had shoved at me the day before, and then I handed her the thick legal portfolio containing the deed to my home, the LLC documentation, and the proof of my $25 million inheritance. Valerie adjusted her designer glasses and read through the paperwork in absolute silence. I watched her perfectly arched eyebrows rise higher and higher with every page she turned. When she finally looked up, a slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "He served you first," Valerie stated, her voice vibrating with genuine amusement. "Your husband, completely unaware that he is a tenant living in a house owned by your family, trust boldly served you with a petition for divorce." I nodded, folding my hands calmly in my lap. "He thinks I have $300 to my name," I replied. "He intends to freeze our joint accounts today and starve me out. He assumes I will be forced to default on legal representation and accept whatever pathetic settlement he offers." Valerie let out a rich, hearty laugh, tapping her manicured fingernail against the deed. "Well, he has made a catastrophic tactical error. Under state law, inherited assets and properties held within a pre-existing independent trust are entirely exempt from marital division. Terrence has zero claim to the Harlem Rose Group. He has zero claim to the commercial skyscraper in Manhattan. And he certainly has zero claim to your $25 million. By serving you and establishing the separation date, while his own secret corporate debts are still active, he has effectively shielded your new empire from his reach. We are going to bury him, Jasmine." I spent the next 3 hours mapping out an aggressive, flawless legal strategy. We drafted formal eviction notices. We pulled the foreclosure records from 5 years ago to prove Terrence had fundamentally breached his fiduciary duty to our marriage. We established a counter-petition that demanded full primary custody of Trey and Aaliyah, citing his financial instability and his deliberate attempt to abandon his family for a subordinate at his workplace. But hiring a ruthless divorce attorney was only the first step of my fortification. I needed to ensure my wealth was completely insulated not just for today, but for generations to come. Leaving Valerie's office, I immediately set up a secure, encrypted video conference with Harrison Sterling and a team of top-tier wealth managers in New York. I sat in my home office, locking the door and initiating the transfer of power. My instructions to the financial team were cold, calculated, and absolute. I directed them to immediately establish 2 ironclad, irrevocable trusts for Trey and Aaliyah. I funded each trust with $5 million. I placed incredibly strict parameters on the accounts, ensuring that the funds could only be accessed for their education, healthcare, and future real estate acquisitions. Most importantly, I installed a corporate trustee to oversee the accounts. I explicitly legally barred Terrence from ever acting as a financial guardian or accessing a single dime of their money, even in the event of an emergency. He would never be able to manipulate our children the way he had manipulated me. Next, I severed every single financial tie connecting me to my soon-to-be ex-husband. I logged into our joint banking portal. True to his cruel promise, Terrence had already drained the checking account, leaving me with exactly $312. He had also removed his name from the automatic payment schedules for the electricity, water, and gas bills, hoping the utilities would be shut off while I was inside with the kids. I smiled at his pathetic predictability. Using my new private accounts managed by the firm in Manhattan, I paid every single utility bill a full year in advance. I completely removed my direct deposits from the joint accounts, effectively cutting off the small but consistent freelance income Terrence had always mocked but secretly relied upon to cover his luxury car insurance. For the next several weeks, I operated in total silence. I became a ghost in my own life. I did not respond to the angry, demanding text messages Terrence sent when he realized I had not moved out. I did not answer his phone calls when he realized the utility companies were not shutting off the power. I moved through my days with methodical, empowering efficiency. I was building an impenetrable fortress around my children and my future. I was laying the legal and financial groundwork for a total, absolute victory, leaving Terrence to drown slowly in the shallow puddle of his own arrogance. While I was quietly building my fortress, Terrence was experiencing a spectacular and highly embarrassing freefall. He had strutted down my driveway, fully expecting me to call him within 24 hours, begging for forgiveness and a grocery stipend. He genuinely believed his absence would cause my entire world to collapse. Instead, his own reality began to fracture almost immediately. Vanessa presented herself as a high-value corporate partner, but the reality of her lifestyle was far less glamorous than the beige designer trench coat she paraded around in. She lived in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up studio apartment in a noisy part of the city. There was barely enough room for her own clothes, let alone the extensive wardrobe of a man who insisted on wearing custom-tailored suits. Terrence lasted exactly 3 days in her tiny space before the claustrophobia and the lack of luxury drove him out. The man who fancied himself a king could not handle sharing a single microscopic bathroom and a miniature closet. With his pride deeply bruised and his options severely limited, Terrence was forced to swallow his arrogance and beg his fraternity brother Kevin for a place to crash. Imagine the sheer humiliation. A 37-year-old corporate finance manager who constantly bragged about his elite status was suddenly sleeping on a lumpy sectional sofa in a chaotic bachelor pad. He was waking up with a sore back and ironing his expensive dress shirts in a cramped guest bathroom, while ignoring Kevin's uncomfortable questions about why a man who supposedly owned a massive suburban home was currently homeless. The physical discomfort of sleeping on a couch fueled Terrence's rage. He was furious that I had not panicked. He was furious that the utility companies had not called to harass him about unpaid bills. He needed to reassert his dominance over me. He needed to feel the familiar rush of controlling my survival. So he decided to play what he believed was his ultimate trump card. He took an extended lunch break from his firm and marched directly into our local bank branch, fully intending to financially starve me out. I know exactly how this scenario played out because my attorney Valerie obtained the financial records and communications later during the discovery process. Terrence sat across from a personal banker with a smug, vindictive smile on his face. He demanded that a total absolute freeze be placed on all our joint accounts. He wanted my debit card declined at the grocery store checkout line. He wanted me to suffer the deep public humiliation of having my card rejected while trying to buy food for Trey and Aaliyah. He told the banker he was initiating a divorce and needed to secure his assets from his supposedly erratic wife. The banker typed his information into the system and stared at the screen in complete confusion. Terrence confidently waited for the confirmation that my financial lifeline had been severed. Instead, the banker informed him that there were absolutely no funds to freeze. The joint checking account held exactly $312. The joint savings account was completely empty. Terrence demanded to know where my weekly graphic design deposits were. He aggressively insisted there must be a glitch in the banking system because my freelance invoices always cleared on Thursdays. The banker calmly explained that the direct deposits linked to my name had been permanently rerouted to a different institution days ago. Furthermore, I had formally removed myself as an authorized user on all of his credit cards, completely insulating my pristine credit score from his mounting secret debts. I had severed the financial umbilical cord with surgical precision. Terrence sat in that bank chair, feeling the blood drain from his face as the crushing reality washed over him. His financial leverage had completely evaporated into thin air. For 7 years, Terrence had mocked my graphic design income, calling it pocket change, and relentlessly belittling my creative talent. But the unspoken truth was that he desperately relied on my hard-earned money to keep his own head above water. My freelance checks covered the groceries, the children's school expenses, the gas, and the minor household repairs. Because I handled all the daily survival costs, Terrence was free to use his corporate salary to pay for his luxury car lease, his expensive bourbon, and his secret romantic hotel getaways with Vanessa. Without my income quietly subsidizing his lavish lifestyle, his entire financial house of cards began to sway dangerously in the wind. The panic set in immediately. I was sitting at my kitchen island enjoying a quiet cup of chamomile tea when my phone screen lit up with a barrage of frantic text messages. Terrence abandoned all pretense of being a cold, calculating professional. He demanded to know where my money was. He accused me of hiding marital assets. He ordered me to transfer my freelance funds back into the joint account, immediately claiming I was legally obligated to contribute to the household. He threatened to call his lawyer and have me sanctioned for financial misconduct. I watched the gray text bubbles pop up on my screen one after another. It was a rapid-fire display of a toxic man entirely losing his grip on reality. I did not type a single word in response. I did not engage with his manic demands or try to defend my actions. I simply set my phone on silent and took a slow, warm sip of my tea. The man who had spent 7 years deliberately making me feel small was currently sleeping on a borrowed couch and panicking over grocery money. He was drowning, and I had absolutely no intention of throwing him a life vest. The relentless and brutal efficiency of my lawyer's paperwork did exactly what it was designed to do. When Valerie formally responded to the divorce petition, she explicitly laid out the legal protections surrounding my newly acquired estate. She did not hide the numbers. She cited the exact statutes protecting inherited wealth and listed the Harlem Rose Group as a pre-existing independent entity. When Terrence read those documents sitting on his fraternity brother's lumpy couch, he finally understood the terrifying magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. He was not just fighting a wife he had casually discarded. He was fighting a multi-million-dollar empire. In his absolute blind panic, he did exactly what weak men do when they are cornered. He picked up the phone and cried to his older brother Malik. It took less than 48 hours for the news of my $25 million inheritance to travel through the family grapevine. The very same family who had watched Terrence demean me for 7 years, the same people who had snickered at my freelance graphic design career, suddenly realized I was the wealthiest person they had ever known. Their entire perception of me shifted overnight, from a convenient punching bag to a glittering human lottery ticket. It was a quiet Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen helping Aaliyah piece together a large cardboard puzzle when the front doorbell chimed. I wiped my hands on a towel and pulled up the security camera feed on my tablet. Standing on my front porch were Malik and his wife, Lauren. Lauren was wearing a pristine cashmere cardigan and clutching a massive, ridiculously expensive gourmet gift basket wrapped in clear cellophane and thick silk ribbons. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a profound sense of disgust mixed with brilliant, dark amusement. Just a few weeks ago, Lauren had sat at a formal dining room table and loudly pitied Terrence for carrying my dead weight. Now she was standing on my doorstep, holding imported cheeses and trying to play the role of a deeply concerned sister. I told Aaliyah to keep working on her puzzle and walked to the foyer. I opened the door with a calm, completely blank expression. Lauren immediately gasped, her face twisting into a mask of exaggerated theatrical sorrow. She pushed past the threshold without waiting for an invitation, shoving the heavy gift basket into my hands and wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating perfume-drenched hug. "Oh, Jasmine, you poor beautiful thing," Lauren cooed, her voice trembling with fake manufactured emotion. "We just heard the horrific details about what Terrence did to you. We have been absolutely sick over it. I cannot even begin to tell you how angry Malik is at his brother." Malik stepped inside, shuffling his feet awkwardly on the welcome mat. He looked around the foyer, his eyes darting across the crown molding and the polished hardwood floors. He was looking at the house completely differently now that he knew I owned it free and clear. He offered a stiff, uncomfortable nod, murmuring something under his breath about Terrence acting like a total fool. I led them into the living room, setting the heavy basket on the coffee table. Lauren immediately took a seat on the sofa, crossing her legs and leaning forward with intense, aggressive empathy. She reached out and tried to hold my hand, but I smoothly pulled back, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, forcing them to sit in the heavy awkwardness of their sudden, uninvited arrival. Lauren could not handle the quiet. She launched into a blistering, eager monologue, completely throwing Terrence and his mistress under the bus. I told Malik the absolute second I met that Vanessa girl that she was nothing but a tacky little homewrecker. Lauren declared, her eyes wide with feigned outrage. I looked Terrence dead in the eye and told him he was making the biggest mistake of his entire life. I told him you were a queen, Jasmine. I told him you were the glue holding this entire family together. I listened to her spin this ridiculous, desperate lie without blinking. The sheer audacity of her performance was almost impressive. This was the exact same woman who had consistently used weaponized microaggressions to undermine my confidence. She was a master of using her privilege to make me feel small and invisible. But now that I held a bank account with more zeros than her own parents' trust fund, her racial bias and classist superiority had magically evaporated. She was desperately attempting to rewrite history, positioning herself as my fiercely loyal ally. Then came the white tears. Lauren brought a perfectly manicured hand to her face, her eyes welling up with moisture on command. She dabbed carefully at her cheek, performing the ultimate victim by proxy routine. "It breaks my heart to see you going through this trauma," she whimpered, her voice cracking perfectly. "We are sisters, Jasmine. We married into this toxic family together and we have to protect each other. Terrence has lost his mind, but Malik and I are entirely on your side. We will always support you no matter what." I sat back in my chair, watching her weep with cold, clinical calculation. A year ago, I might have fallen for it. I might have desperately craved the validation and accepted her fake sympathy just to feel a little less alone in the world. But I was no longer that desperate, isolated woman. I saw right through the watery eyes and the soft cashmere sweater. I saw the absolute blinding greed driving every single word she spoke. Malik and Lauren did not care about my broken marriage or my emotional well-being. They cared about the $25 million sitting in my private trust. They wanted access to my wealth, and Lauren was using her tears as a crowbar to pry open the vault. Instead of calling her out on her blatant hypocrisy, I decided to play the game. I needed to know exactly what they were after, and I knew Lauren talked far too much when she believed she had the upper hand. I let my shoulders slump slightly, adopting a posture of quiet, submissive vulnerability. I lowered my gaze to the floor and offered a soft, appreciative sigh. "Thank you, Lauren," I said, keeping my voice gentle and subdued. "It has been an incredibly difficult time. I just feel so overwhelmed by everything that is happening so fast." Lauren leaned in closer, her eyes flashing with a predatory glimmer of triumph. She thought I had swallowed the bait completely. She thought I was exactly the same naive, submissive woman I had always been, just with a much larger bank account. She reached out again, and this time I let her pat my knee. "We are here for you, Jasmine," she promised, her voice dropping to a warm, conspiratorial whisper. "Whatever you need, we have your back. In fact, Malik and I were just talking about how you are going to need a strong support system to manage all these sudden financial changes. Family has to stick together right now, more than ever." I offered a small, tight smile, nodding in agreement. Family absolutely has to stick together. I replied, my tone perfectly even. I sat quietly in my living room, allowing Lauren to continue digging her own grave. I was going to let them lay out their entire agenda, because I knew this visit had absolutely nothing to do with comfort. They were circling their prey, but they had no idea they had just walked willingly into a trap. I offered Lauren another cup of coffee and let her keep talking. She took the bait completely. Within 20 minutes, the fake sympathy pivoted smoothly into a calculated business pitch. She started talking about how hard Malik had been working on a new tech logistics company. She sighed heavily, claiming that traditional banks were being unreasonable and that all Malik needed was a small angel investor to get his brilliant idea off the ground. She threw around phrases like family wealth and generational legacy, looking at me with hungry, desperate eyes. Lauren even had the audacity to suggest that since I was so new to managing this kind of money, Malik could help me navigate my investments by letting me buy into his ground floor opportunity. I nodded thoughtfully, asking probing questions about their profit margins and operating costs. Malik puffed out his chest, trying to sound like a seasoned executive, but he stumbled over basic financial terms. It was glaringly obvious that his tech company was nothing more than a failing pipe dream. They did not want my emotional support. They wanted me to write them a massive check to save them from their own impending bankruptcy. I told them I needed to consult my financial advisors before making any major moves, but promised I would host a formal dinner for us to discuss it further. They practically skipped out of my house, leaving their ridiculous gift basket behind, convinced they had successfully manipulated the naive, heartbroken wife. The second the front door clicked shut, my demeanor hardened. I picked up the heavy basket of imported cheeses and dropped it directly into the trash can. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure priority message from Harrison Sterling and the team of forensic accountants I had hired in New York. When I first retained them, I instructed them to execute a microscopic audit of every single financial transaction Terrence had made over the last decade. I needed to know exactly how deep his secret corporate debt went, so I could obliterate any claim he might try to make during the divorce proceedings. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and opened the encrypted file they had sent. I expected to see a long list of maxed-out credit cards and unpaid personal loans. I expected to see the receipts from his luxury car lease and his expensive bourbon. But what I saw on the very first page of the audit report made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Terrence had not just been living beyond his means. He had committed an act of financial violence so profound and unforgivable, it took my breath away. According to the meticulous tracking done by my accountants, Terrence had actively siphoned over $40,000 from Trey and Aaliyah's college savings accounts. 5 years ago, when we first opened those 529 plans, we agreed to automatically deposit a portion of his corporate bonuses to secure our children's educational future. It was supposed to be untouchable money guarded specifically for their growth. But over the past 6 months, Terrence had steadily drained those accounts. He had forged my digital signature on the withdrawal authorizations and transferred the funds into a hidden offshore checking account. The accountants provided a brutal, itemized list of exactly where my children's tuition money had gone. The IP addresses and timestamps matched perfectly with the nights Terrence claimed he had late-night finance emergencies. The funds paid for the luxury hotel suite in Miami for Valentine's Day. They paid for the expensive steakhouse dinners downtown. They paid for the designer silk blouses, the expensive perfume, and that ridiculous beige trench coat Vanessa wore while standing on my front porch telling me to pack my bags. Terrence had stolen $40,000 directly from his 8-year-old son and his 6-year-old daughter to finance his miserable, pathetic affair. A new kind of silence settled over my home office. It was not the silence of shock or the heaviness of grief. It was the terrifying, absolute stillness of a mother who has just discovered a predator has been feeding on her young. For 7 years, I had endured his emotional abuse. I had swallowed his insults and let him call me a leech because I believed he was at least providing a stable foundation for Trey and Aaliyah. I had insulated my children from his cruelty, taking the brunt of his toxic behavior to keep their world intact. I accepted wearing worn-out shoes so he could buy Italian leather because I thought he was ultimately protecting our family. But seeing the irrefutable proof that he had robbed his own flesh and blood to impress a junior analyst shattered whatever remaining shred of humanity I thought he possessed. He did not just destroy our marriage, he actively sabotaged the future of the very children he claimed to love. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, burning rage. It crystallized into a cold, razor-sharp weapon. Kicking Terrence out of the house was no longer enough. Divorcing him and leaving him to his own financial ruin was entirely insufficient. I was going to strip him of every single thing he valued in this world. I picked up my phone and dialed my attorney, Valerie. I read the accountant's findings out loud to her. I heard the sharp intake of breath on her end of the line, followed by a low, predatory chuckle. She informed me that draining a child's college fund to support an extramarital affair was the exact kind of financial misconduct that completely destroys a parent in a custody battle. Any judge would look at those bank statements and strip him of his parental rights without a second thought. I instructed Valerie to prepare the final legal strike, but to hold off on filing the custody motion and the fraud charges for just a few more days. I had a very specific stage in mind for this execution. I opened my calendar and selected a date for the following week. I was going to host that formal dinner I promised Malik and Lauren. I was going to invite Terrence and his arrogant mistress under the guise of an amicable settlement discussion. I would let them walk into my home believing I was a broken woman, ready to surrender my wealth just to keep the peace. I was going to gather the entire toxic collective under my roof, feed them a beautiful meal, and then systematically burn their entire world to the ground. I spent the next 3 days orchestrating the final act of my marriage with the precise calculation of a military general. I hired a private executive chef and a discreet high-end catering staff to handle the evening. I wanted absolutely nothing left to chance. I wanted to sit at the head of my mahogany dining table with empty hands and a clear mind completely unbothered by the logistics of serving food to the people who had tried to destroy me. I chose my wardrobe for the evening with surgical intention. I wore a tailored emerald green dress that hugged my curves perfectly, serving as a subtle but undeniable nod to the immense wealth I now commanded. I looked like money. I looked like absolute power. I looked like the multi-million-dollar executive they had severely underestimated for the better part of a decade. The invitations had been meticulously crafted to play directly into their specific brands of greed. I emailed Terrence and Vanessa through my attorney requesting their presence for what I called an amicable settlement discussion. I hinted heavily that prolonged litigation would be emotionally exhausting and that I was willing to negotiate a generous financial exit package just to keep the peace and move on. For Malik and Lauren, I simply sent a text message confirming we would review their tech logistics investment proposal over expensive wine and appetizers. They all took the bait instantly. Malik and Lauren were the first to arrive. Lauren practically floated through the front door, wearing a crisp white designer blazer and a smile so fake it looked physically painful. She immediately launched into her performative sisterly routine, complimenting my dress and whispering how incredibly brave I was being. Malik trailed close behind her, clutching a thick leather binder that presumably held his disastrous business plan. I offered them glasses of vintage champagne and directed them to the formal living room, acting the part of the gracious, completely oblivious hostess. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I instructed the hired catering staff to open the door. I wanted Terrence to be greeted by uniformed help in the very house he once claimed he provided single-handedly. I stood at the threshold of the dining room as he and Vanessa stepped into the grand foyer. Terrence looked noticeably strained. His custom suit hung a little looser on his frame, a direct result of sleeping on a lumpy couch and drowning in secret corporate debt. But he thrust his chin up desperately, trying to project his old, arrogant authority. Vanessa clung tightly to his arm. She was wearing a tight black cocktail dress that screamed trying too hard and clutching the exact same designer handbag Terrence had bought her using my children's stolen college fund. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Vanessa looked around the foyer, taking in the high ceilings and the crystal chandelier with a mixture of intense jealousy and arrogant entitlement. She honestly believed she was walking into a negotiation where I would hand her boyfriend a massive check just to make her go away. Terrence cleared his throat and offered a stiff, formal nod. He tried to walk toward the head of the dining table, the seat he had claimed and dominated for 7 years. I stepped smoothly into his path and gestured to a chair on the side. "The head of the table is reserved for the homeowner, Terrence," I said, my voice light and perfectly polite. "You can sit over there next to your brother." His jaw clenched tight, but he did not argue. He knew he had zero legal ground to stand on. He pulled out the chair for Vanessa, who glared at me before sitting down with an agitated huff. I took my seat at the head of the table, looking down at the 4 greedy, desperate people gathered under my roof. The private chef began serving the first course, a delicate lobster bisque. I played the role of the unbothered host flawlessly. I asked Malik about his drive through the city traffic. I complimented Lauren's blazer. I even asked Vanessa if she was enjoying her new living arrangements, knowing full well that Terrence was making her miserable in her tiny apartment. They all shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sipping their wine and exchanging nervous glances. Lauren tried to break the ice by loudly declaring how wonderful it was that we could all be mature adults and handle our business privately without messy courtroom drama. Terrence jumped on the opening. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, trying to look like a commanding corporate negotiator. "I am glad you finally saw reason." Jasmine Terrence began, his tone dripping with his usual condescension. "Prolonging a messy court battle helps absolutely no one. Vanessa and I are ready to move forward. If you are willing to offer a lump sum settlement to buy out my remaining marital interests, we can sign the non-disclosure agreements tonight and leave you in peace. You get to keep your little inheritance and I get the capital I need to start my new life. It is a win for everyone." I looked at him, marveling at his absolute delusion. He genuinely believed he had leverage. He thought my invitation was a white flag of surrender. He thought I was a terrified woman desperately trying to pay off her abuser to avoid a public scandal. Malik nodded in agreement, tapping his leather binder excitedly. "And once that is settled, Jasmine, we can get down to real business," Malik chimed in. "My startup is primed for exponential growth. A $2 million seed investment from your trust would guarantee you a massive return. You need someone with business acumen to help you manage this kind of wealth." Lauren reached across the table and touched my arm lightly. "We just want to see you thrive, Jasmine," she cooed, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. "We are your family. We are here to guide you through this transition." I let them talk. I let them build their magnificent castles in the sky. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, cold taste on my tongue. They were gorging themselves on their own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath them was about to drop out. The appetizers were cleared away, and the main course was served perfectly on cue. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and smiled at the 4 people who had made it their mission to destroy my peace. It was time to pull the trigger. The catering staff moved silently around the table, clearing the appetizer plates and placing delicate crystal bowls of rich, dark chocolate fondant in front of each guest. I waited until the last server retreated into the kitchen and the heavy wooden doors swung shut, leaving just the 5 of us isolated in the dining room. Terrence was still smirking, believing he had thoroughly dominated the conversation. Lauren was delicately slicing into her dessert, her eyes sparkling with the false anticipation of a massive payday. I reached into the pocket of my emerald dress and pulled out a sleek silver remote control. The formal dining room opened directly into the main living area where my massive 85-inch flat-screen television hung on the stone accent wall. I aimed the remote and pressed a single button. The enormous screen flickered to life, instantly casting a bright, harsh light across the dim, romantic ambiance of the dinner party. I had not connected the television to a movie or a slideshow of family memories. I had linked it directly to a secure encrypted folder on my tablet. The display lit up with a high-definition, blown-up screenshot of an iMessage group chat. The chat title at the top of the screen read "Family First," but the contents were anything but familial. My forensic accountants were incredibly thorough, but Terrence was also incredibly stupid. When he synced his old personal tablet to our home network months ago, he left his cloud messaging logged in on a device sitting right in my home office. I found it while securing my assets and downloaded every single word. Malik froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. Lauren squinted at the bright screen trying to read the text bubbles. I watched the exact second the recognition registered in her brain. The fake sisterly warmth completely vanished from her face, replaced by sheer unadulterated terror. Terrence snapped his head around to look at the screen, and his jaw practically unhinged. I stood up slowly from the head of the table, my posture rigid and absolute. I pointed the remote and scrolled down to a specific date, highlighting the messages sent on the exact same day Terrence ambushed me with divorce papers on the front porch. I began reading their words out loud, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. Lauren wrote. I read my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. I cannot believe Terrence is finally dropping the dead weight. Jasmine is going to end up in a shelter. Do you think she will take the kids back to her mother's cramped house? I clicked the remote, scrolling down to the next text bubble, and Malik replied, Good riddance. Now Terrence can focus on real money. Vanessa is a huge upgrade. She actually knows how to dress for a corporate dinner. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her chest puffing out slightly at the twisted compliment, completely unaware that her turn was coming next. I kept my eyes locked on Lauren and Malik. The wealthy, entitled woman who had just spent the last hour holding my hand and calling me a queen was suddenly trembling in her designer blazer. But wait, I said, offering a chilling smile. I have not even gotten to the best part. I clicked the remote again, fast-forwarding the timeline by 48 hours. This was right after Terrence made his frantic phone calls crying about my $25 million inheritance. I read the new messages, allowing the desperate, greedy tone to echo in the dining room. Lauren wrote, Terrence, you absolute idiot. She has $25 million. You have to fix this immediately. Malik and I are going over there tomorrow morning to play nice. Do not tell her we knew about Vanessa. We need her to fund the logistics company, or we are going to lose our house. Malik added. Just let Lauren do the talking. Jasmine is desperate for approval. If we pretend to be on her side, she will write the check and we can save the startup. I lowered the remote and looked down at my brother-in-law and his deceitful wife. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lauren was clutching her linen napkin, her knuckles entirely white. Malik looked like he wanted to melt directly into the mahogany floorboards. His thick leather binder full of fake business plans sat uselessly next to his chocolate dessert. You wanted a seed investment, Malik, I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. You wanted me to fund your failing pipe dream with the same money you and your wife were mocking just a week ago. You thought I was a desperate, naive woman craving your validation so badly that I would hand over my inheritance to a man who cheered for my destruction. Lauren scrambled to stand up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Jasmine, please, she stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the room. Her voice took on that familiar, high-pitched panic, pulling out her ultimate weapon. Real tears began to stream down her face. That was taken completely out of context. We were just trying to appease Terrence because he was acting so erratic. We love you. You are my sister. Save the tears, Lauren, I commanded, cutting through her manipulation like a scythe. They do not work on me anymore. They certainly do not work when a massive screen right behind you proves that you are a treacherous, opportunistic parasite. You walked into my home, you drank my champagne, and you tried to con me while smiling to my face. I turned my head and signaled to the broad-shouldered private security guard I had quietly positioned near the front door before the dinner began. He stepped into the archway of the dining room, his arms crossed over his chest. Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Williams off my property, I instructed the guard without breaking eye contact with Lauren, and make sure they leave their empty business binder on the table. They will not be needing it. Malik stood up, his hands shaking as he tried to formulate an apology. Jasmine, look, we are deeply in debt. We were desperate. I am sorry for what we said. Lauren grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the table. She realized her charm offensive was entirely dead. Her face flushed a dark, angry red as the mask completely slipped, revealing the bitter, entitled woman underneath. You are making a huge mistake, Jasmine, she hissed, her voice vicious and cold. You are going to need family to survive in this world. I am surviving just fine without you, I replied. If either of you ever attempt to contact me, my children, or approach my estate again, I will buy the bank that holds the underwater mortgage on your house, and I will foreclose on you myself. Now get out of my sight." The security guard stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Malik's shoulder and guiding them both toward the foyer. Lauren let out a frustrated, indignant sound, but she did not resist. I stood at the head of the table and watched them walk out the front door. The heavy wood slammed shut behind them, severing my ties to the toxic extended family once and for all. I slowly turned my attention back to the dining table. The audience had shrunk. It was just me, my husband, and the junior analyst, who thought she had stolen a king. I picked up my champagne flute and took a slow, victorious sip. I had effortlessly taken out the collateral trash. Now it was time to absolutely obliterate the main targets. I turned away from the heavy oak front door and walked slowly back to the head of the dining table. Terrence sat frozen in his chair, his face a sickly shade of gray. He had just watched his brother and sister-in-law get tossed out like common trespassers, and the reality of my absolute authority was finally crushing the last remnants of his ego. Vanessa sat rigidly beside him, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. She was trying to maintain her composed, sophisticated facade, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. She still believed she was walking away with a wealthy corporate prize. She still thought Terrence was a high-value provider. It was time to pull the curtain back on the final illusion. I reached into my leather tote bag resting on the floor and pulled out a thick, black, glossy folder. It was the master copy of the forensic accounting report my financial team in New York had compiled. I did not hand it to my husband. I slid it directly across the polished wood, stopping it right in front of Vanessa's crystal water glass. "Go ahead and open it, Vanessa," I instructed, keeping my voice light and conversational. "Since you are so focused on building a corporate empire with a man who brings real financial value to the table, I thought you should see exactly what you are investing in." Terrence snapped out of his daze. He reached blindly for the folder, but Vanessa was faster. She snatched it up, her manicured nails digging into the cover. She flipped it open and her eyes immediately dropped to the first page of the executive summary. "Terrence is not a millionaire, Vanessa," I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. "He does not even have a positive net worth. That luxury sedan he drives is leased, and he is currently 3 months behind on the payments. The designer coat he bought you, the luxury hotels he took you to, the expensive dinners you enjoyed, they were not funded by his corporate success. He financed your entire 6-month affair by maxing out 5 secret credit cards and actively draining his own children's college savings accounts." Vanessa gasped sharply, her eyes widening as she flipped frantically through the bank statements and audit logs. The color drained from her face for the second time that month. But I saved the best piece of intelligence for last. "Turn to page 7, Vanessa," I commanded. "You work at his finance firm. You know exactly what a corporate audit looks like. My forensic team discovered that Terrence has been quietly misappropriating company funds to cover the tracks of his massive personal debt. I forwarded a copy of this exact file to the compliance board at your firm yesterday morning. He is currently under a full-scale corporate investigation. He is not just broke, Vanessa. He is going to lose his job, his license, and he might very well be facing federal charges by the end of the week." Terrence jumped up from his chair, his face contorted in absolute panic. He reached for Vanessa, pleading with her, swearing he could fix it, claiming my accountants were lying. But Vanessa looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of the wealthy, successful provider was completely shattered, leaving only a desperate, drowning man. She slammed the black folder shut and shoved it hard into his chest. "You lied to me!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of my dining room. "You told me you were loaded. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic fraud. You are going to drag me down with you and ruin my career." She grabbed her purse and did not look back. She marched straight out of my dining room, leaving Terrence standing completely alone in the echoing silence of his own spectacular ruin. He tried to call out her name, but the heavy front door slammed shut, severing his last remaining tie to the life he thought he commanded. I simply sat back down, picked up my champagne flute, and took a quiet, satisfied sip. Fast forward 3 months to the conclusion of the divorce proceedings. I sat in a cold, brightly lit courtroom wearing a tailored white suit, feeling an incredible, undeniable sense of peace. Terrence sat at the opposing table looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. The corporate investigation I initiated had resulted in his immediate termination. Without his massive salary, he could not afford a high-powered attorney. He sat there relying on a court-appointed public defender, while my shark of a lawyer, Valerie, presented the judge with the undeniable forensic proof of his financial abuse. Terrence kept his head bowed, staring at the scuffed floor of the courthouse, unable to meet my gaze. The confident, arrogant man who used to terrorize me over grocery money was completely eradicated. The judge, an uncompromising woman who had zero tolerance for parental theft, looked at Terrence with absolute contempt. She slammed her gavel down and delivered the final fatal blow to his ego. Because he had deliberately and maliciously depleted Trey and Aaliyah's college funds to finance an extramarital affair, the judge stripped Terrence of all joint custody rights. I was granted full primary custody with total decision-making authority over my children. Terrence was ordered to pay back every single stolen dollar in restitution, though we all knew he was completely bankrupt and facing impending criminal charges for his corporate theft. He walked out of that courtroom with absolutely nothing. He had no house. He had no mistress. He had no family support. He had no career and no future. The very man who had called me a leech, who had tried to throw me away like garbage, was now entirely erased from my life, leaving me to build my new empire in absolute peace. 6 months have passed since that cold courtroom stripped my ex-husband of his remaining dignity. Today, the morning sun spills across the polished hardwood floors of a massive penthouse office in Midtown Manhattan. I'm standing in front of a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over the magnificent sprawling skyline of New York City. The city moves far below me, a vibrant rushing river of yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians, but up here the air is perfectly still and serene. I hold a warm cup of coffee in my hand, listening to the beautiful sound of Trey and Aaliyah laughing in the adjacent lounge area. They are building a towering fort out of designer fabric swatches and architectural blueprints. They are safe, they are unconditionally loved, and they are standing at the very top of their own kingdom. I did not just inherit a building and sit back to watch the bank accounts grow. I took the creative passion that Terrence used to mock, and I built an absolute empire. The freelance graphic design business that I used to operate from a cramped kitchen island late at night has been entirely rebranded. It is now a multi-million-dollar creative agency, and we are headquartered right here on the 50th floor of my own skyscraper. I employ a diverse, brilliant team of 40 full-time designers, copywriters, and brand strategists. We handle national campaigns for major corporate clients who pay top dollar for the exact same artistic vision my ex-husband used to dismiss as a silly little hobby. Walking through my agency, hearing the hum of creative collaboration, and seeing my name gleaming in brushed brass on the reception wall is a daily reminder that my talent always had immense value. I just had to remove the man who was constantly trying to block my light. But the most important transformation happened on the ground floor of this building. When Uncle Elijah first bought this property, the street-level space was zoned for luxury retail. I ripped out the high-end boutique fixtures and completely redesigned the entire level. I transformed it into a state-of-the-art community tech hub and creative incubator specifically dedicated to underprivileged African-American youth. We provide free access to coding boot camps, high-end graphic design software, and mentorship programs for kids coming from Harlem and across the boroughs. I named it the Elijah Rose Innovation Center. Every time I walk through those double doors and see young, brilliant Black children learning how to build their own digital empires, I feel Uncle Elijah standing right there beside me. He knew that true wealth is not just about hoarding cash in a private trust. True wealth is about building a ladder and dropping it back down so the next generation can climb up. He saw the structure of things, and now I am teaching hundreds of kids how to see their own potential. They will never have to shrink themselves to fit into a world that tries to tell them they are not enough. Looking back at the nightmare I survived, the biggest lesson I learned is the absolute danger of letting someone else dictate your worth. For 7 long years, I allowed a deeply insecure man to convince me I was a financial burden. I accepted his definition of value because society teaches women, and particularly Black women, to compromise our peace for the sake of holding a family together. Terrence called me a leech because projecting his own financial incompetence onto me was the only way he could feel like a powerful man. He desperately needed me to be weak so he could pretend to be strong. But a toxic partner can only keep you in the dark if you forget that you are the one generating the light. The moment I stopped accepting his disrespect, the moment I recognized the sheer magnitude of my own resilience, his entire illusion collapsed. You must never let anyone convince you that your sacrifices, your creativity, or your maternal labor are worthless simply because they do not come with a corporate paycheck. You hold the power to define your own value. Karma is a breathtakingly precise force. You do not have to scream or throw tantrums or seek chaotic revenge when people betray you. You simply have to gather your resources, stand firmly in your undeniable truth, and let their own arrogance lead them directly off a cliff. Terrence thought he was discarding a helpless dependent on his front porch. Instead, he handed me the exact motivation I needed to conquer the world and leave him utterly destitute in the ashes of his own deceit. I reclaimed my peace, I protected my children, and I took my rightful place at the head of the table. If you have ever had to rebuild your life from the ground up after someone tried to break your spirit, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and share how you reclaimed your power and turned your painful setbacks into your greatest comebacks. We draw strength from each other, and your victory might be the exact inspiration someone else needs to finally walk out the door. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing stories of survival justice and absolute triumph. Remember to always know your worth, fix your crown, and never apologize for building your empire. The most profound lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by someone else's inability to see it. When toxic people try to diminish your value or weaponize their perceived power, it is a reflection of their own deep-seated insecurities, not your reality. True strength lies in silent resilience, gathering your resources and protecting your peace rather than seeking loud, chaotic revenge. Once you realize your own power and establish unshakable boundaries, the illusions of those who tried to break you will inevitably collapse. Never shrink yourself to fit into a room when you are destined to own the entire building. Share your own journey of reclaiming your power in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories of ultimate triumph.